Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I was going to say good morning or good afternoon. We're just in the good afternoon. So hope you're enjoying Glasgow and COP26. This is a Bright Blue fringe event with power to change. For those of you who don't know us, Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Our mission is to defend and improve liberal society. There's more about us on your chair, so please do take away that literature. Today we're discussing a local solution, Britain's low-carbon community energy. Lots of people are also watching online. Thank you for tuning in. And you'll be able to participate online by asking questions through Slido, and the link is below the TV screen that you're watching. Just tell us who you are and where you're from, and I will field those questions after we've heard from the speakers. Also, please do tweet using the hashtags BrightBlue and COP26. We want to amplify some of the messages and arguments that are being raised in this discussion today. So really the questions around community energy which we want to ask are: what role can community energy play in the transition to a low carbon smart energy system? Why should the future of energy be local? What policies and interventions are needed from government to support the scaling up of community projects across the UK? And how can community energy be feasible without financial support from government? Is NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism, a barrier to the development of community energy projects? And what are the wider economic and social benefits of community energy? So lots of questions there, and we've got a great panel with us today to discuss this. So on my far right, we have Patrick Alcorn, who is the head of local net zero in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK government. To my near right is Dr. Afshin Rashid, MBE, who's the founding director and chief executive officer at Repowering London. To my near left is Brian Whittle, MSP, who's the Shadow Minister for the Environment, Biodiversity and Land Reform as part of the Scottish Conservative Party. And then to his left, we have Vijaya Alexan, who is the Chief Executive of Power to Change. And then on the far left is Dr. Matthew Hannon, who is the Senior Lecturer at the Human Centre for Entrepreneurship at the University of Strathclyde. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. This afternoon. And we will start with Brian with his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ryan, and good afternoon. It's great to be at this event. I've done quite a number of events, and it's actually been quite enlightening. I have basically been soaking up as much information as I possibly can, and looking, how do we develop policy going forward. I think the talk today is around community energy and the part that community energy will play, and I think tackling climate change and moving to sustainable forms of energy won't just see a change in the sources of energy, but also a change in where that energy is generated, how it's used, and who controls it. I think one of the key questions we're asking today is what role community energy can play in the transition to low carbon. I think it's safe to say the answer is a pretty central one, where our energy needs were once supplied by a relatively small number of large industrial power stations burning fossil fuels. We're increasingly moving towards a more disaggregated model of energy generation, and for purposes of this discussion, I intend to put the idea of nuclear power to one side. Although I think we know, given some of the recent or the announcements, that we are going to have to discuss nuclear energy at some point, and pros and cons of nuclear energy at some point as part of that potential solution. I think, when we talk about nuclear energy, as soon as you say the word nuclear, everybody goes nuclear, because everybody thinks of Chernobyl. And I think watching the development of what's happening over there, it is definitely interesting. I think we've got a bit to go, but it's certainly interesting. I think we're moving towards a new pattern of energy production where energy is generated, stored and distributed more locally, from the sort of small-scale wind powering industrial sites and farms to solar panels on homes and on buildings. I mean, why should it be local? Well, out of necessity, to be quite honest, is one of the realities of it. I think the system that currently moves energy around the country is creaking at the seams anyway. I think that it was described to me really, I think very succinctly, as what we need is a honeycomb of energy production where, there's autonomous community projects, but that are also linked to the rest of the bigger system, and are not necessarily, if it goes down, we can, it's not relying totally on itself, but it can pull energy from elsewhere if required. But I think we are moving towards a system where traditional separation between producers and consumers of energy becomes much more blurred. We're talking about policies that are needed from government to support the scaling up of this type of project. For me, it's government's responsibility to create the environment that allows industry, communities and individuals to make choice. It gives them a route into that. And I think that governments should be much more able to seed fund projects. I always think that if a project has public support in terms of seed funding, it is much more likely to give the business world, the business community, a bit of comfort that it's worth investing in. I think we need so planning needs to be simplified, and the speeding up of the planning application process. I was hearing the other day that to do offshore wind, a new offshore wind can take up to a decade. That is just too long. I think we need to support coordination and facilitation the community to come together around the project. I think that's one of the things I don't think we're very good at, is actually disseminating information about what's available. And I think I said there's that financial support. I think underwriting the early stages, I think is often overlooked, but very important is the building of public confidence in these schemes. And one of the biggest issues around renewable transition more widely is public scepticism about technologies. The idea, does it work for me? And I think where we are at the moment, I think we're always saying there's something else coming down the road. So for me, it's almost as if the public are going, well, if there's something else coming down the road, why should I jump and take this technology? So we're not making it easy, and I think that's something we really need to look at. And I think for all those people that are as old as me, that remember Betamax tapes and mini discs and HD DVDs, which only find themselves in a world of VHS, MP3 and Blu-ray. How can community energy be feasible without financial support from government? Well, as I said before, I think private finance has a huge role to play here in delivering this ethereal net zero, and it's something that industry is I think is prepared to take on board. But again, we need the collaboration between public and private funds. I think social enterprises, they're not all ideal for all situations, but they have a role to play, and some schemes simply won't be feasible without government financial support. I think the NIMBYism a barrier most definitely is. I have been in a few of these. I'm a South of Scotland MSP, so we have a plethora of turbines, a forest of turbines in the south, and my mailbag is full of people who don't want that. They want wind, but they don't want it in their backyard. So it is a problem, and I think it's something that we haven't yet tackled. Wider economic and social benefits. Well, there's an interesting project down in Cumnock, the core project, which is actually funded by the UK government and local council to the form of 17 million by the UK government and 7 million from the council, who are trying to take Cumnock off the grid. So Cumnock becomes a self-sufficient energy generating, and then able to put, if they generate more electricity than they need, put that back into the grid. So that becomes a positive economic benefit to that. So. And obviously resilience. I think with localised networks and storage system, we're less vulnerable to large-scale power cuts, especially if we have that sort of honeycomb, if you like, where we are connected. And lastly, I'll finish here, is around tackling fuel poverty. I think some of the projects are already being deployed, combining renewable heating energy systems with lower costs, like social housing projects. So that's very much a whistle-stop tour of where I think we need to be, but I will stop there and hopefully we can generate some discussion later.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. And if you've just entered, please do feel free to, if you feel courageous enough, come to the front of the audience. So, Brian, you talked about some of the kind of barriers, I suppose, which are kind of thwarting the sort of maturing of the community energy market. Some of that seems to be on the kind of individual, maybe lack of time, lack of knowledge, costs, NIMBYism, and then there's this sort of stuff on the institutional side, which is lack of government support, the planning system, etc. What if we're putting a hierarchy in place, what do you see as the kind of biggest barrier or biggest barriers to kind of scaling up community energy generally?
Funding. We looked at to heat all the homes in Scotland from renewable energy, putting heat pumps in and the like. We worked it out, it's going to cost £33 billion. If you put that in context, we've had this great big number of 100 billion globally, but we could spend 33 billion, upgrading the heating system, which is one of the big polluters. So finance for sure. So for me, that £100 billion, fantastic. When we talk about the link between collaboration between public and private investment, Anybody that's worked within this kind of market would know that if you put £100 billion in of public money, you should be able to leverage £1 trillion. You should be able to say, look, we're putting this in. We should be able to get globally funds, and we need it's trillions that we need. It's not billions. We need trillions, and it's a huge number, but there's a way to do that. So I think the way in which we link public funding and private funding is going to be hugely important, both from a local perspective, i.e. council, Scotland, UK, and obviously the significant amount of funds we need for the global south to make the impacts we need down there. I think we don't put across to the public what's available. I actually had an engineer in to look at changing my boiler last week. And I asked the question, is there a possibility of putting a boiler in there that somewhere down the line we'll be able to switch on to hydrogen? And he went, I don't know. Well, if British Gas don't know, what's the likelihood of the public knowing? And I think it's looking ahead and saying, look, I do think green hydrogen is going to play a significant role going forward. And I think innovation, what governments should be doing is ensuring that innovation it can thrive and is free to thrive, because quite frankly it will be the private sector that solve this problem. They caused the problem, but they're also if we allow them to innovate, they will solve the problem. So I think in that respect, I said it's government greasing the wheels, if you like, and allowing that sort of innovation to happen.
Great. Okay, so we've had the sort of Scottish perspective there. So we'll move now to Patrick, who's sort of, I suppose, giving the kind of UK government perspective. We haven't got a UK minister, but often people say civil servants are really the people in charge. So very interested to hear from Patrick.
I'm not sure I could claim that for one moment, although some might argue. So I'm Patrick Hawke, I'm head of the local net zero team in Bays, and have been working on community energy on and off for about 10 years. And like everything, policies ebb and flow. Things are in fashion and out of fashion, and I think that's one of the lessons that we need to learn. But what I'd like to just bring up, there are a huge number of different types of communities. So it's not just about geographic communities. There are communities of interest as well. So bringing together the power of organisations like National Trust with their 1 million+ members, Women's Institute, all of these are communities within the United Kingdom or within other countries that can be harnessed to talk to their members, to convey messages, to show off. National Trust is a really good example of an organisation that has done quite a lot to decarbonise, but hasn't told its community particularly well what it's done. So bringing those two sides of the organisations together. And then, of course, you have urban communities, you have rural communities. I mean, they face different problems, different opportunities. But I thought I'd just spend most of my 5 minutes talking about a story I heard yesterday of a small village in a valley, beautiful valley, at the end of the national grid distribution network, so with very little power. Lovely river running through it, all the people off gas grid, so having oil boilers, they all drive diesel cars, drive significantly further than the average families. Most houses have 2 cars, above average, etc. Huge, relatively, footprints, much, much bigger than the average UK person. Talked about doing something about this, and were told that it would be between 5 and 8 years before they could get a grid connection that would allow them to move to heat pumps and electric vehicles en masse. So 1 or 2 of them might be able to do it on the existing capacity, but because they were at the end of the line and because they're very small, actually, it's a long time before the DNO will ever get round to investing in them. So they looked at the river and went, well, we could do this ourselves. So they can put a 45 kilowatt hydro scheme into the river. They can put solar on the roofs. They can put batteries and heat pumps in and run that system themselves without any of that upgrade cost. But the DNO doesn't recognise that as a service. So it doesn't have money to pay for the upgrade, so it doesn't have money to contribute to the alternative solution. The Environment Agency, I think, are currently consulting on increasing their extraction licence. So the cost of actually developing that project is significantly higher, and that money is at risk. So where does that at-risk investment come from to help that community that have brought all the households together to deliver this project, but can't actually get it off the starting blocks because there is these barriers that we as government and institutions put in place? So I think there is a real opportunity here to identify where this is the cheapest solution, where this is the optimum solution, and really bring to bear all of the things that government can do, not just about putting money in up front, but actually working with the institutions to make that happen. And Brian was talking about the wind farms in Scotland and some of the NIMBYism. But if you look at the success that Fintry had when somebody came and said, can we put wind turbines here? And the village said, well, we'll own 10% of it. And they have built themselves a whole lot they've insulated all the homes. They've built themselves a sports facility. They've built off-road cycle paths to the school in the next village, all from refinancing that package. And that renewable energy is bringing a whole new community to that place in the Trossachs. So there's a really, really good examples of everything. Community energy has solved most of the problems somewhere. We just don't tell the story well enough. We don't harness that knowledge because the community are just getting on and doing the next thing. They're not there as PR representatives. They're not there. So I think one of the things that government needs to do with organisations like Afshin's is to tell those stories better, to make those stories more realistic and make it possible for them to be replicated and done again and again around the country, so that investment can look at them and say, well, actually, there are 30 of these, not one at a time, and aggregate that together and bring that commercial funding that Brian was talking to bear, because they're not going to get out of bed for one village of 300 people. It's not a big enough project. But if you've got 30 villages doing it at the same time, then the banks will be interested, the investors will be interested, because you've got scale. So the challenge for government that we're trying to tackle is, how do you get the scale in the community energy by using the brilliant work that they've done so far to create an opportunity for communities right across the country to do that.
He's just stolen my pitch.
Yes.
He's doing a brilliant job.
That's the benefit.
I'm on the panel.
That's the benefit of being in government. You go first, yeah.
Now, Patrick, just before Afshin tells her story, and hopefully she's got something original to say, is just, I think for a lot of people watching, including online, just thinking about what community energy is, because you talked about a lot of different communities. You talked about National Trust, Women's Institute. I think a lot of people, the layperson who are not particularly knowledgeable about this area, would think, the village that you all talked about, and coming together, producing energy, microgeneration, having ownership in some of the energy there. Most people would think about that as community energy. Yeah. Is there a sort of definition that you can give to people so people know the territory we're working in?
No, and I don't. We keep being asked this because for the feed-in tariff, we had to legally define it in Parliament, and the legal definition became about the generation. And I think that misses so much of what community energy does. And if you go back to the early 2000s, a lot of the community energy organisations you see now were starting in providing free support and advice to vulnerable people around energy efficiency. So they were energy advice services. When the funding ran out for that, they moved into generation because they could generate money to do that sort of thing. So if you look at the work in South East London, that the community energy group there are doing with energy cafes and things like that, where vulnerable people can bring their bills, they can be helped to switch, they can be told how to cheapen their, that is a significant part of community energy that gets lost if you focus just on a hydro project or a wind project, because actually those are the people, your community are the people you trust most to help you. You talk about the trust values of banks and energy companies and politicians, and you can, they come significantly further down any list of public trust than the people who you live with and that you work with and that you see on a regular basis. So I think if you define it too narrowly, you lose from that definition the real heart and soul of what community energy was and is today. And the wonderful idea in Bristol where they bought themselves 2 thermal cameras and they go around and take photos of strangers' homes and then post them through the door saying your home's leaking money, if you want advice come and talk to us, and they've got a little card and a little photo. Genius way of engaging people, because actually it's your neighbour doing it, it's not the council doing it, it's not central government doing it, it's not an energy company doing it, it's the person who you saw at the pub last night or football at the weekend. So I think we've deliberately not defined it because it is all of those things to all of those people, and that's its strength.
Okay, so in the absence of a tight definition, what I am hearing though is that whatever the initiative around energy or the provision, there's some kind of local community involvement or ownership over it, and I think it's important to
trouble is it's government that gets in the way of that.
Right.
To be honest.
Yeah, I can summarize maybe 3 core principles would be that community control, management, community benefit, which is really important. So making sure that whatever intervention is coming in, money be it or resources or value, it's staying locally and it's providing that local benefit. And that governance and control comes through those democratic principles, where you've got local directors, they're making the decisions, they're creating the solutions and making those decisions, and there's job opportunities for them through that. So if you're putting in the turbines or you're putting in the solar assets, there's some element of management, there's some element of job creation there that someone locally could benefit from as well.
Yeah, very good. That's very clear. Okay, over to you. Your story.
My story. So at Repowering, just to give a bit of context, we work with communities to plan, fund and build their low carbon futures. We want to make sure that local people are empowered but also benefit from those from those projects. At Repowering, our aim is to make sure that no one's left behind. The energy transition is really complex. Lots of changes are going to come our way. We focus on particularly in working in inner city environments, in areas of high social deprivation as well. So there's a lot of change happening and a lot of people are unable to participate or benefit from the green revolution. We're here to make sure that they do. So what do? We create community-owned solar power projects, or the solar power stations. We've established the first inner city community-owned solar power station in Brixton back in 2012. So we've been around a while. And I wanted to share, the story of our latest project, which is in North Kensington, 4 years ago, North Kensington Community Energy didn't exist. There wasn't a community energy group in the borough, in the West London. We worked with the local authorities, so that great collaboration with the local authority, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They had a climate change team, and the officer there was a real champion and was really inspired by what we did in Brixton and wanted to see a similar approach in North Kensington again, which is an area of high deprivation compared to the rest of the borough when you think about Chelsea and people with a lot of money. And we set about engaging the community and identifying local champions. And we had a few people who joined us. But 4 years on, today, North Kensington Community Energy is an energy co-op. It has 15 volunteers who are driving the agenda forward. We've got like local directors, 4 of them live locally, activated locally. We've installed solar panels on 4 community buildings. We've raised more than £200,000 in the borough. We've got like a membership of 200 people who have invested in the schemes, put their money into these schemes. And now this group of volunteers, they're running events in their local area called Greener Living Days and connecting people in their community to other activities around, waste or recycling and transport. So there's this real trickle effect, that impact in the local community. And to me, that's the beauty of community, of empowered communities, of that investment in the local people and the drive that they have. We're not only about generation, we're also about tackling fuel poverty. As I mentioned, we're working with the most vulnerable in the community. So the income from some of these projects have actually helped those most vulnerable. And last year, I wanted to share our Brixton Energy Co-ops who have been generating for the last 10 years. They've put money aside to fund fuel emergency vouchers for local residents. And that was, they identified what was the need in their community and they quickly shifted and mobilized that money to enable that to happen. And at Repowering, we have a locally rooted champion-based model. So we've got paid champions in the community who live locally, are connected locally, and are really able to make sure that our services reach those who are generally not heard or communicated with. And likewise, we've got champions in different boroughs who are raising awareness of community energy in their communities. And most importantly, what we do is also involve our young in the community. So there's this intergenerational aspect, and we've delivered training programs for young people. More than 100 young people have benefited from our AQA paid training program. Yes, it is paid. We pay them to attend the sessions because these are young people from disadvantaged communities who don't have role models in their homes or their communities and who aren't able to join a free internship or work placement. They do need to be incentivized and paid to be able to get off the streets and find what new opportunities out there for us. So we offer a training launchpad for them to be able to identify what could be the future green jobs for them, so that we are able to recruit and identify that diverse talent pool, which is so needed. As we know, the green sector is not diverse at all. So there's lots of value that we provide as community energy. And I just wanted to finish off with, the Committee on Climate Change has said at least 60% of the measures required to get to net zero will require some level of behaviour change. If not, they're wholly dependent on people embracing new technologies and changing their behaviour. And community energy groups like Repowering are well placed to be able to do that.
Great. And you said not Kensington. That's the name.
North
Kensington. Not Kensington.
No,
although
not
in Kensington I thought would be a bit weird.
North Kensington. North Kensington Community
Great.
Energy.
Okay. Well, it sounds
Yes.
very good, the stuff that you're doing. A question for me is obviously, there's the sort of community benefits from it. But what about the kind of economic benefits? What's the sort of average rate of return for somebody investing in community energy? What does it look like in terms of hard numbers?
Yeah, it's a good point. We always talk about the social impact because we've been told by Patrick that, the social impact is so important that we forget to mention the financial. So people investing in our schemes get 3% return on their investment. In some areas, there are projects that are offering 4% return. on their investment. Our schemes have been in Brixton 10 years on. Every year they've got a 3% return, and I tell you, there's people invested in us 10 years ago probably didn't believe that they would see any of their money or like a return, let alone a return. So this has been great for them, and they end up being repeat investors in new schemes. And in North Kensington Community Energy alone, we've seen, when we first ran a share offer, we raised £80,000, and we then recently did a share offer this year during the pandemic Christmas time, November launch, and in 2020, and we closed our share offer in Jan 2021, and it's the worst time to be fundraising, but we raised £100,000, and that just showed how people were committed to doing their bit on climate change, but also the motivation. When we asked people what motivated you, it wasn't only climate change, it was that local benefit as well. The returns of 3% was the third, further down the line in terms of motivation. But they do, for those who are interested, they do get a 3% return. They get the capital back, and it's a relatively low risk investment. But now that the feed-in tariff has gone, we'll see, and ask to government, is possible tax relief for us being able to really capitalise on the market. But generally, tried and tested technology, solar panels are so fairly assured investments for people. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, some of the local authorities have been doing municipal bonds, and one of the things they've seen is, and it's the same with community energy, those investors foregoing some of that interest because they want to reinvest it in wider community benefit. So they invest for a 3% return, but actually they're quite happy for that to roll over to be used in other ways. So so you see quite significant wider community projects being put up. So in Fintry we're talking about the cycle lane, for example, but all across the country you can find examples of where they've invested in other things in the community as a result of raising this money. It's not just about the panels on the roof. There is a much wider programme of work.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we've heard sort of government, community. Let's move to the sort of academic voice. On the far left of the panel, a lot of people would say academia is normally there, but perhaps you'll surprise us. Matthew.
I'm not sure I will. Okay, well, good morning. In fact, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Dr. Matthew Hannon. I'm a senior lecturer within Strathclyde Business School, just behind you for those of you who don't know where it is. I'm also trustee and chair for a community environmental charity just in the south side. In fact, we can probably just see where it's located, just out there in the window, called Southseed. So I've got a sense, probably some of my colleagues here, about how the pains and gains of these community energy organisations. So in the context of what community energy can offer us as a country, those of you in the room, investors, I just want to frame two key problems that we need to tackle going forward, and then three solutions. So the first is we need to go wider, deeper, faster and fairer in terms of our net zero emissions reductions. Wider, deeper, faster, fairer. We need to go wider in terms of we need to move across sectors we've barely touched, transportation, buildings. Deeper, that those that we've already decarbonised, like the power sector, we need to go even further still. Government has just announced that they would like 100% of our power to be sourced from renewables by 2035. We need to go faster now that we've committed to net zero. The sixth carbon budget is painful. If you look at the Climate Change Committee's projections for what that means in terms of emissions, we fall off a cliff in just a few years' time in the 2030s. So we need to be prepared for that. And fairer, just transition, a term that's been used a lot by Scottish government, and I would say has now very much commonly used in policy and energy conversations in Scotland, not one that I think has penetrated maybe the UK energy policy landscape. But all of you in the room here will no doubt be familiar with the term of and the policy of levelling up. So when we look at the disparity and the inequality of the richest and the poorest, the ONS in their latest data on this have identified that the richest 1%, their share of total income has grown from 7 to 8.3% in the last, I believe it was 10 years. So when we put that in context, we have an environmental issue and a social issue at hand, where energy is a point at which we can start to tackle both of those simultaneously. So how do we do that? Well, the first is that we need to win hearts and minds. There was a fascinating interview with Boris Johnson's climate spokesperson for COP26, Allegra Stratton, many of you will know. And I thought it was fascinating when defending his decision to fly to COP from the G20 summit and fly back to Westminster after that. The moral argument that she put forward was personal choice. I like personal choice. I'm quite sure you do too. Personal choice is something which makes us human, which makes us able to live in a free country that I very much value. But it can't be personal choice at the expense of somebody else's. And crucially, we need to frame that personal choice in a way that makes attractive these low carbon choices, these fairer, greener choices. We need to create a marketplace where there are multiple options available to us and where we are not closing down, not only closing down options, but opening up new ones. And I think community energy is well placed to do that in terms of winning hearts and minds, because you are presenting a value proposition which isn't just greener, but can, as we've already heard, offer a reasonable and low risk rate of return for your investment, so economic box ticked. And socially, you can be contributing to improving the value and the social fabric of your local community. So there's a triple bottom line available there. And I think if we can sell that right, and I think Patrick is pointing at this, if we can sell that story, if we can pitch it right, there's a triple bottom line that I think everybody can buy into. Second, if we're going to go deeper, wider, faster, we need to unlock untapped potential. If you look out of that window, there are many rooftops there without solar on. There'll be many homes that aren't properly retrofitted. If you look at the hill just there, many of you can't, but I see Catkin Braes there. There's a singular turbine on there. 3 megawatt turbine, cost £5 million to install in 2013. That's a joint partnership between SSE, which their offices are just next door, and Glasgow City Council. There would probably be a lot more turbines on that hill if the community around about there had a direct stake in that, and as we've heard, are contributing and benefiting from that community turbine. So I think there's untapped potential. And it's not just the resource, it's not just the power or the energy efficiency. It's unlocking people's personal wealth, their wallets. We spent upwards of £50 billion during the first 5 months of the pandemic on aesthetic refurbishment of our homes. Very little of it had any focus on green or energy measures. And it's also about unlocking passion. Many of you will be passionate. You'll have hobbies, you'll do things at the weekend, you'll do things of an evening. We need to unlock that, and part of that is about seeing the landscape outside improve. So I'll finish on the third point, and I'll put policy recommendations to one side. Hopefully, I guess we'll get round to those, because I would like to talk about that. The third is to make it fair. And I really do think, so the two or three of the key pillars of energy justice are distributional justice, i.e. you distribute the pains and the gains of investment, and procedural and recognition justice, where you are distributing the power, the agency to make the decisions around which that wealth is redistributed. Now, to do that, community energy is a really potentially powerful tool. If you give somebody a stake, you give them voting rights, you give them control. That ticks that procedural box. And if they are able to enjoy 3 to 5% return, and also a community benefit fund which they have control over, you tick that distributional box. And I will end on a warning, and this is me, I often beat the drum for community energy for good reason, but I will end on a warning. If done poorly, community energy could undermine a just transition. If we allow a system where community A, a wealthier, higher skilled, maybe a higher proportion of retirees at a particular age, if we allow them to be able to draw down subsidy, which is raised across everybody's bills, regardless of wealth, then they are directly benefiting from maybe a less wealthy, more deprived community B just next door. And we can't allow that to happen. And we need to hardwire a fairer system in terms of the raising of revenue and then the spending of that revenue to ensure that community energy is doing the right things. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Great, very eloquent, Matthew. Thank you. And you've given me an opportunity to promote some of Bright Blue's work, which is always good. So we did do a report called Delivering Net Zero a couple of years ago, which looked at how you might, we've committed to it, how are you actually going to deliver it, particularly in those sort of hard to decarbonise sectors like home heating and transport. How do you do that? So your sort of theme of deeper, wider, faster reductions, please do look at that report. Something else which we brought out over the summer was looking at, it was a report called Green Money, and we looked at how you can get more consistent carbon pricing across different economic sectors. At the moment, there's a lot of inconsistency. But one idea that we did talk about, which has come from Canada, is this idea that the revenue that you get from that more consistent carbon pricing, but also as a result of increased green industry and revenues from those industries, perhaps you can pay particularly low-income voters, low-income people, a dividend, a kind of green dividend. Canada talks about climate checks, and they have them in particular provinces. Is that something that perhaps you think would be of appeal, which is, a lot of people, when they think about the net zero transition, there is some kind of cost consequences, particularly in terms of the way you heat your homes and you transport yourself. But also there's lots of, on a more aggregate level, there's much economic boon that comes from the green transition as well. So can we kind of compensate those low-income people as well as making sure that they get a fairer share of the rewards that are coming through on an aggregate level through those sorts of policies?
I'll answer quickly. I appreciate we've still got other panellists to speak. So just two quick responses to that. I think the first is that the fairest way to do this is to shift policy costs and taxation on bills into income tax, where you have a more progressive structuring of how those revenues are raised. It makes no moral sense to me that you can have a fuel poor home just over there that are spending exactly the same proportion of their bill on green levies, network costs, VAT, and you're looking at these hardwired shares of their energy bill. When in the postcode over, you've got a family who are, £100,000 net income, and they're paying exactly the same proportion. So that this has been pointed at colleagues from the University of Leeds, and I would strongly recommend you look at this. Colleagues Anne Owen, John Barrett have looked at shifting that from bills, policy costs from bills to income tax, which would make for a fairer world in that regard. What I would just add as the second point is green dividend. I think community energy can provide that. And I think we need to target subsidies at deprived communities, urban as well as rural, to enable these projects to happen, and the dividends will be forthcoming if the projects are structured right. And I'll pause there because we'll hear all about how we can finance those projects. I'm very excited about what I was hearing before, so thank you.
Great, okay, thank you very much. And just to say, for those of you who are watching online, and I know lots of people are, you can ask questions through Slido, and the link is below the YouTube screen that you're watching. So please do ask us a question, tell us who you are and where you're from. So finally, Vidya, over to you.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. So just a quick word about Power to Change before I talk more specifically about community energy. So Power to Change was established in 2015. We're an independent charitable trust, and we were established very specifically to accelerate the growth of community businesses across England. So we are England only, but I think everything that we've learned applies more broadly than that. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've, together with partners, invested about 45 million in community energy. So we've both supporting communities to take ownership of renewable energy assets, largely solar farms, as well as supporting community energy businesses to innovate and embrace new technologies and business models, particularly in the post-subsidy world. So we've, I think, been one of the only funders really to try and help community energy businesses bridge that transition and the innovation required to bridge that transition following the end of subsidy. And I think the downside of coming last is you have to sort of package up everything that everyone else has already said. But I think I wanted to highlight 2 specific elements of why we think community energy is important, and then come on to talk about a financing model we've put together, which is trying to address this issue of scale that's been alluded to. I think it's very clear from all the research, particularly over the last couple of weeks, that there is real public concern now across generations, across income groups, around the climate and nature crisis. But it's also really clear that that the public needs support to translate that concern into concerted action. We've heard that in various different ways. And community energy businesses and community businesses more broadly, I think, are superbly well placed, as Matthew has already really said, to do that and to support people to make that transition. I think they have a real competitive advantage in terms of being locally rooted, which means they tend to understand really deeply the communities that they're working with, how to engage them, how to motivate them. And they're also deeply trusted. And unlike the energy sector, which kind of falls almost below banks and the financial services sector these days, and it's encouraging that when we surveyed community businesses, and we produce an annual market survey, the one that's coming out in a month's time, showed that 72% of community businesses across all sectors, not just community energy businesses, are already doing things to tackle the climate and nature crisis. They're already taking positive environmental action. So they're already, I think, on the front foot. And I think we saw in COVID just what community-rooted organisations can do to support local residents, to take action, to adapt, to get by, to feel like they're supported. Many community businesses were right at the heart of their local COVID responses. Many of them were providing the backbone to lots of the mutual aid responses that were going on at street level. They were kind of aggregating a lot of that activity. And I think we need the same kind of embedded approach for the transition to net zero, and I think there really is a comparative advantage there for community energy. And you've heard about the fantastic work of Repowering London, and actually when we started Power to Change in 2015, I think the first place I went to was Repowering Brixton. I took the whole board. They weren't expecting to climb this sort of little metal ladder up to the rooftops of an estate in Brixton, but they did, to see what was going on and meet some of the trainees. So it's great to see how that's grown and flourished. But I wanted to tell you about the work of Ambition Lawrence Weston, which is, Lawrence Weston is an estate on the edge of Bristol, and they are undertaking a whole raft of positive climate action related projects. So they have growing projects there, they have upcycling projects, and they are trying to put in place the largest wind turbine in the country. So it's a really impressive community-led project. They have community-led housing there too. It's a really in the round, very, very impressive community project. But I think what's really interesting, and Mark Pepper, who is the manager there, is speaking at one of the Bright Blue events later on today. So if you're still here, please catch him because he's fantastic. They're really clear that in order to get local buy-in, what they need to talk about is tackling poverty and social justice, not majoring on climate change. And actually they found that when they do talk about climate change, they actually get a lot of pushback from their local residents. And I think that really illustrated for me when I heard Mark, I did an event with Mark on Monday, really illustrated this idea of the fact that community businesses are so locally rooted that they understand how to motivate local people to take action by framing things in exactly the right way. And I think a lot of the language that we use as a sector, if we can describe ourselves as that, active travel or a climate and nature crisis, just doesn't resonate for a lot of people in a lot of communities, and we need to find the ways in which we can engage with people, and community energy has a real comparative advantage there. And I think this points for me to something else which is really important, which Matthew's already alluded to. So I think rooting solutions locally makes it much more likely that there will be a just transition. Because I think one of the things that's inspired me from the day I started Power to Change, when it was only me in 2015, it's grown quite substantially since, is at the local level, in local communities, in neighbourhoods, this division that we have in policy terms and kind of at the national level between the economic, the social and the environmental really kind of comes together in a concern for the well-being of local people and the kind of state of the local physical environment. The triple bottom line I see expressed most powerfully at that local community level, where it comes together much more in a much more integrated way. So I think that is at the heart of so that locally rooted nature of community energy really gives us an opportunity to put those bits of the triple bottom line together. But also, and I think we've heard this already, the democratic ownership structures of community business mean that communities can benefit from the opportunities that will come with the climate and nature crisis. So rather than others benefiting and extracting from their communities. We can see communities retaining local wealth by capitalising on the opportunities that will arise from, what is a crisis, but will generate new businesses, new business models, etc. And I think one of the things I'm always struck by is when I look at, so we've been working in Grimsby for the last 4 years in one of the most deprived wards in Grimsby. And when I look at the Freeport and the offshore wind going on in Grimsby and talk to the people that we work with, particularly through an organisation called Centre 4 in Grimsby, they see no benefit coming to their community from that offshore wind. So it's doing a lot for the overall GDP of the country and potentially for the wider region, for the Tees Valley. But for that community, there's very little that's changed as a result of all of that growth. Community energy is a way of capturing some of that benefit directly for the local community. So I think I think community energy can be easy to dismiss because in megawatt terms, it's not significant if you're looking at it on that scale, but it has some huge comparative advantages, which, given that local behaviour change and public acceptance are at the heart of the transition to net zero, I think it needs to be taken incredibly seriously. And then I just want to finish off by talking about a project that we've done over the last 4 years now. It's taken longer than we thought, called Community-Owned Renewable Energy, which is really trying to address this scale problem. My colleague Will Walker is in the room and is responsible for a lot of this. So if you have more specific questions, I might have to bring him in. So we fund community assets of all different kinds. And one of the consistent challenges with community assets is that communities can rarely raise the capital quickly enough, partly because there aren't ready sources of capital to actually get hold of assets in a competitive private market. And despite the fact that the government tried in 2011 to create rights that would enable communities to do this more easily, they've not really been very effective. So the communities, organisations often lose out in the competitive race to get assets. And in markets like energy, where actually you're competing with BlackRock to kind of get some of these assets, it's incredibly difficult. So what we did in 2017 was create a joint venture of £40 million between us and Big Society Capital, which, for those of you who don't sort of live and breathe the social investment world, is the kind of the government's established sort of wholesaler for social investment. So trying to move more capital from reclaimed bank account assets was the initial pot towards social purpose projects. And so what that joint venture has enabled us to do is buy up 6 solar farms with the intention that over time we will transfer those into some kind of community ownership. But the critical thing about that is that we've been able to create ownership at scale. So we have a portfolio that's of about £30 million. And the bit that's now currently very exciting is that we're able to get institutional debt, so debt from pension funds, which is cheap and at large scale, to come in and now refinance this investment. So we take some of our initial money out, and the institutions kind of hold this for the long term. And so I think there are, what CORE has demonstrated is, to me at least, is there are opportunities to tap into those large scale private sector pots of capital. It has been more difficult, and we've been through many trials and tribulations in trying to get there. But we are now on the point of hopefully by the end of this year, actually refinancing this through the institutional markets. And it does really point to the idea that there isn't enough grant funding or public funding around to support community energy at the scale that we need it. We are going to have to find ways, I think, to create the sort of scale that can get a private sector that increasingly talks about ESG being a strong motivator for what it does, to kind of get that capital to move into this sort of sector. So I'm kind of encouraged by what we've experienced, and hope that we can find other ways to aggregate and create scale to make more of that possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya. Very persuasive, powerful stuff there. And a question for me really is about the kind of level of community energy schemes there are at the moment. I mean, you've talked about the 45 million that you've invested at Power to Change, and all power to change in the future. That's great stuff. But in terms of where we are, nationally, in terms of numbers of community energy schemes, and what people are saying, either in government or outside experts, about where we could potentially get up to, what sort of numbers are we looking at, if you have that sort of
I haven't got it on
available?
I haven't got that on the top of my head as to how many schemes there are. Will probably does.
On the State of the Sector report, there's about 424 organisations
There's about 320 megawatts
Right.
currently installed. So actually, the project you're talking about
Yeah.
would be
Grows
a
up
10%
massively.
growth
Yeah.
overnight.
Right.
And that was intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
just to
is
put
there,
it into
is,
scale.
well, is there a sort of target amongst the community energy world or inside government of where they want to be in terms of number of schemes,
Yeah.
or there is?
There is.
Right.
We've got a 2030 vision document produced by Community Energy England, and our ambition is to grow at least 10 to 12 times from where we are right now, being able to power over 2 million homes is the equivalent of generation capacity we want to create across the board, and using that would allow and create around 8,000 jobs. I think those are the initial figures that come to my mind that we've put out there in terms of scale and that local value that will be created back in the economy.
I was just going to say, in England we don't, but in Scotland obviously they have 2 megawatt was it 2 megawatts? No, what is it? 2 gigawatts of community ownership by 2030 as a target, and in Wales they have 1 gigawatt of locally owned energy by 2030. So the devolved administrations have targets in them, although we don't at UK level this time.
The interesting thing about that is, though, that they have this sort of global figure, if you like, in Scotland, how much how much more power we want to raise from renewable energy, but we actually still don't. And they have this figure of 2 gigawatts, but they still don't have a plan of how to get there. And I think, to me, that's where the issue lies. Is we're really good at setting these kind of targets. We're going to have an extra 11 gigawatt through onshore wind, and then we're going to develop into offshore wind, and we're going to we're going to do all this, but actually, we don't have a route map to get there. And I think, across the whole of COP, and I've listened to a lot of different countries talk about this, is we're really, really good at setting targets. But where's the route map to get there? So yes, I think it is important. The first step is we have this target, and you're right that we have a target up here of 2 gigawatts, but I'm yet to see the route map that says we can deliver that.
So I think you delivered the interim target of 1 gigawatt by 2020. So it happened
we're on the way
to that level.
Yeah,
so,
we're on the. If you don't set a target, then you obviously you have it's open ended, and there's no sort of drive towards that. But you have to have a route map to deliver that, and that's really what I push for. Is I'm up for big targets. My past life, the targets were my thing, but you have to have you have to work it back to say, tomorrow we're going to do this, which will start to deliver towards that, and we're still to do that.
And what was your past life?
I was an Olympic athlete.
Oh, right, okay.
Is that right?
Yes, very target heavy, yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, very, very impressive.
I was about to.
Just a very quick point on that. I think we have to differentiate between what's being counted by the State of the Sector report from the community energy organisations and what is being covered by this 1 gig target.
Yeah.
So the 300 megawatt target amount is for community owned. The 1 gig is community and locally owned.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're incorporating council ownership, for instance, in that, which I think just an important differentiation.
Yeah, good clarification. Yeah. Let's open it up to questions. I'm getting lots of questions virtually, which proves people are out there, which is good. But what I will do is take questions from the floor first, because you came all this way to Glasgow for this event, so you get priority, even though maybe your carbon footprint is not as good as people watching virtually. I don't know. Well, it depends on how they're generating their electricity and everything. But anyway, I will take questions from the floor here. So please wait for the microphone to come to you. That's important because the live stream needs to hear you. So this gentleman here, the microphone's on its way. If you could say who you are, where you're from, that would be great.
Finn Jensen from Penland Community Power, where I'm a director, and I've been involved in community energy for the last decade or more. And I have to say generally that government policy has made it harder and harder over the years to actually do the job. And you have to ask why there's been constant undermining our work we're trying to do locally, with all the benefits we can see actually co-host the energy schemes. But leaving that aside for now, in other countries there are more supportive policies from governments that can actually help community energies. I'm talking about the Nordic countries, for instance, or Germany. Let me just give a couple of examples. That, for instance, grid connection is a big problem because the community energy schemes often have to pay for it themselves. I mean, we want to put some solar panels on 2 barns in a farmer area, and the quote from the National Grid was £58,000. It killed the project overnight. We couldn't get it to stack up. But in other countries, the grid is responsible to expand to allow renewable energy to connect wherever it is. So it's not the ownership of the community energy to pay for upgrades. It's the ownership of the grid to make sure that they do it. In certain countries, renewable energy has the first right to be connected to the grid. Not in the UK, unfortunately. So if you can produce energy cheaper by nuclear or by any other fossil fuel, they get the first right to be connected. So again, it undermines community renewable energy, I would say. And the only way we can really get it to stack up is if we make a power purchase agreement or a PPA. Most schemes otherwise won't survive very long without that. So you see, for instance, in Germany, in Hamburg and Berlin, where the community take ownership of the distribution systems, not just generation, but the distribution systems. And
which is great. Got a bit of policy tourism. So I'm going to ask some of the panelists just to reflect on some of the policies that were discussed there and what more we could learn from overseas in terms of what leading countries are doing in this. Brian, and maybe I'll come to Patrick afterwards.
Thank you for your question. So I think you raise a big issue here, and it's around when we're going to tackle climate change. It will require significant policy change. It will require significant directional change in how we develop policy. And before I came into politics, I was very much of the Billy Connolly sort of view of politicians, that the desire to be a politician should ban you from life from ever being one, because I always thought that the policy come in with an intent in one end, and by the time it goes through all the committees and gets kicked about and bashed and stamped on, it comes out a shadow of itself on the other side. So the intent of the intent now, if COP26 is going to be successful, the intent now is going to have to be globally. Governments are going to have to change the direction of travel in which we go on, where it doesn't just rely on pounds, shillings and pence at the other end. It's going to require an outcome. And if nothing else that comes out of COP, that is going to be really important. But it was interesting. I was at a lecture the other day, or a debate the other day in the Scottish Power Building, and we had a former head of state who had decided that they were going to change policy to drive the green agenda. They were going to change a lot of their policy to drive the green agenda, and guess what? He got voted out. And that is a problem, because we have to take the communities and people with us. We have to sell we're going to make this change, and this is why we're going to make this change, and this is the long-term strategy and long-term view, which climate change is. It's long-term. It's not a 5-year cycle. I always think that the role of a politician, in base terms, is to get voted in the next time, which is a 4 or 5 year cycle. We need to look at 20, 30-year cycles. So we have to be better at communicating outcomes and objectives in terms of so we take communities with us, because at the end of the day, government can change policy, but the people can decide whether they keep that government or not.
Patrick, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
So, I mean, there are lots of parts to your issues, and it is there are a number of players that are making decisions in that space, not just the government, but Ofgem and private energy companies and a whole range of things. But I think what I'd say is, in this country we have a market system, and you are unlikely to see that market system changed for the very small scale of community energy, where the costs, in order to get the costs right for community energy, if that affects the costs across the board for other people. So it is a wider systems discussion, rather than just how does community energy benefit from the costs, or how does the whole system work. And that is, as we have seen on a number of occasions with attempts to reform it, quite a difficult thing to reform in a systematic way. And I mean, we've worked with Afshin and community energy groups on consultations around costs within the system, and to better or worse outcomes. And Ofgem have, I think, 7 different costs within that market mechanism, and they deal with each of them separately. Now, that obviously, each time they change one of those, that has an impact on everybody in the market. But because of the size and scale of community energy, they feel it harder because they can't absorb those changes. They can't flex as much as the bigger companies. And we haven't quite managed to get that balance in policy development, I don't think, that supports you. We've taken people, we've sent ministers to see some of the stuff in Germany in the past. And in fact, I think Forum for the Future took a range of people back in 2014 to see community-owned networks and grids. And technically you can do that through the independent DNO legislation, but it is very costly to play in the market in this country, and it does favour the incumbents at the moment. So we do need to have a look at that as we go forward.
Matthew?
Yes, I'll just begin with a few. So through research we've undertaken Strathclyde with colleagues at Imperial and also Manchester through the UK Energy Research Centre, come up with a kind of few policy recommendations which we believe are sorely lacking. So I think if we just begin with the money first, then I'll move into stuff which isn't money. So the first is, in the absence of the feed-in tariff, what's happened is that finance has been harder to secure for community energy groups. If you haven't got the long-term subsidy, the project's riskier, people don't want to touch it. Whether that's institutional investors or even community energy investors, it's less attractive than it once was. So there's a need to ask the basic question: what subsidy do we require to bring additional investment and finance in? I'm not sure we're having that open debate yet between the various stakeholders. That may be additional grant funding. It may be some kind, I'm not saying reinstating the feed-in tariff as was, because that was problematic in many respects, but having one that's focused on small-scale schemes which are community-owned, which, as we've pointed out before, they don't have the might, the administrative, financial might to do these projects. It's costly and it's difficult. The other is the finance chain. So actually you need to have a joined-up finance chain all the way from seed funding through to bridge funding to get the project into the development stage. And then you need the funding to actually deploy and then potentially to refinance later on. Now, in Scotland, that's pretty well joined up. I'm not so sure in England. I think we've got big gaps with regards to that. I'm moving kind of away from money. Sorry, I should say tax relief. That was mentioned before. The SITR, the Social Investment Tax Relief. This was community energy was ruled out from this a few years back, with concerns that private investors into energy cooperatives were kind of gaming the system, which may have been true in a very small number of cases, but it has essentially ruled out a number of very positive investment cases. Capacity and resources. Just want to move on to this quickly before I end. Access to land and buildings. Scotland is UK leading on this front. We have the community right to buy. We also have the community land fund. Community right to buy puts in place the legislation for communities to step forward and be almost first refusal, as it were. And the second is the community land fund gives them the money to actually bid for that land. We've seen big buyouts initially kicked off with Isle of Egg, but moving into Langham and others. So they need this land and buildings to do the projects, yet many of these communities in urban areas don't. I think, rattle through the last one or two here, capacity building. Communities often don't have the means and time to develop these kind of projects, so they rely on intermediaries. Companies like Energy for All have been fantastic, and I'm sure other companies here sitting at the table have been able to help. And I'll just finish on needing some kind of wider access to the energy market. You know, licensing for these companies is pie in the sky. I mean, they have to spend considerable funds on becoming licensed to access that wider market. And finally, I'd like to see from BEIS a community energy strategy. I think the last one, Patrick, may have been in 2013. Obviously, the UK net zero innovation strategy, we've seen the initial report. This will be expanded going forward. But I'm unclear from a UK government perspective what role it sees for community energy and how that is aligned with the devolved administrations. They're all pulling and pushing in different directions, which is problematic when you have reserved and devolved powers that don't align. So Scottish Government can do some things, but not everything. Ditto with the UK Government. I'll pause there.
Great, very, very informative. Vidya.
Yeah, so it follows on exactly from that. I think I wanted to pick up on something that Patrick said in his remarks, which was that community energy has gone in and out of favour, which is absolutely right. But that creates a really challenging policy and financing context, and the two being very interrelated, as Matthew's already said, in terms of the subsidy enabling finance to happen more easily. That it just creates a very difficult environment for anybody to plan. I mean, these are 20, 30-year projects, as everyone on the panel knows. The chopping and changing of policy and the fact that regimes aren't there for the long term and consistent makes it much more difficult for these projects to get going and to continue. So when we started the community owned renewable energy, you know, some of the assets that we purchased have got subsidy and some haven't, because we were kind of caught in the middle of the change in the subsidy regime. And I think, I mean, one of the things that I think it's fascinating as an indicator of the difference that policy change made is, you know, a lot of community energy projects are financed through community shares, or at least partly through community shares. If you look at the community shares market, I mean, it falls off a cliff when the subsidy regime changes, because a lot of the community shares market was actually built from community energy. It was the main sector that was driving the whole shares market. Anyway, it's slowly picking back up now with other sectors and energy share offers coming back in. But this chopping and changing, the coming in and out of favour, just is really, really challenging for what are, you know, as Matthew's already described, relatively small, relatively often volunteer-led organisations that are doing amazing work. But what they need, if we think they're important, is a strategy and then a consistent framework of policy and financing, not necessarily a return to the old subsidy regime, but a consistent framework that's going to last for long enough for them to really be able to make the kind of change they're trying to.
Yeah. Okay, let's have some more questions. I'm conscious of time, so and lots of people got questions. So we'll take now people here. So we'll start with Dan, who is, I'll say, a burgundy jumper. Am I allowed to say that? It's a very nice burgundy jumper.
No offence taken. Yes, Dan Watkins. I'm a councillor in Kent, and. Oh, it is on. It is on. Wonderful. Councillor in Kent, and Ryan will pleased to hear me say I'm also a Bright Blue member. I just about to complete my first community energy project in Herne Bay, which is the town I represent, and I've sort of got the bug for it. So my question is, I'm sort of interested in doing a second project in my area, and I'd be interested to see if anyone on the panel would have an example they could point me at, because it would help with my learning and hopefully doing something next year. I sort of often think with community energy, you're often looking for a sort of big area or space that you might put solar or a big heat pump in, and then, you know, collectively fund it and collectively distribute the energy and the funds. But I'm sort of wondering whether there might be a model which would be quicker to deploy, and you might be able to verify this, validate it, whereby, say, a community energy fund sets up and it buys, let's say, 20 heat pumps, because they're flavour of the day, instead of 20 gas boilers, for individual properties, not a collective site, but we go into 20 homes, could be council home tenants, could be private sector, and take out 20 gas boilers for 20 people who agree this, and we put in 20 heat pumps, the problem with renewable energy technology is expensive up front, but longer term, you pay less every month on your energy bills, and the payback of solar is about 7 years, and a heat pump is about 10 years after the government subsidy. So there's money in there, and the private sector or an energy cooperative or whatever could make a return on those kind of numbers. So does it, and community energy is more trusted than, say, big energy coming in and saying, we will do this as energy as a service. So do you think there's a way that you could actually say to a community, put your hand up, 20 people, we will buy the heat pump, we will put it in, and you will just pay us your normal energy bill, maybe give them a 10% discount. The numbers still work, so they are ticking the climate box, but they're also getting a slightly reduced energy bill. But you are recycling that money over, say, 10 years and making a return yourself, and then could go and do this again. But the principal thing that's different from anything I've seen anyone talk about is the fact that you would own it as the energy trust, but it is attached to an individual property, whether it's a solar panel on the roof or the heat pump in a house. So sorry, it's a long question, but
no,
thanks.
it's a good question, and I'll bring someone in to answer that in a second. But yes, brilliant question, and thank you for being a brilliant advert for Bright Blue membership as well. You can meet more people like Dan if you become a Bright Blue member. Let's have this gentleman next to Dan, and then we'll go to the lady behind.
Hi, I'm Matthew Logan. I work with Community Energy Scotland, based up in Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides. I just wanted to hear a bit more about the panellists' views on communities engaging with offshore wind. I think it's something that Community Energy hasn't maybe clearly got a plan of how best to engage with those types of developments yet. In Scotland, with this first ScotWind leasing round, there isn't a requirement for a community benefit provision within leasing options when developers are applying for those leases. So I'd be interested to hear how you think communities can engage with those projects.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go to this lady behind, and then this lady to the right as well.
Thanks.
If you could make your question relatively short, that would be great.
Don't worry, it is.
Thank you.
My name's Izzy. I work at Oxford Energy's Centre for Net Zero. Something we haven't touched upon in this discussion is the role of digital and its potential to upscale the impact of community energy. Anyone can now, own a bit of a solar panel or, part of a wind turbine, regardless of where they live. To what extent is that a real game changer, do you think? And that's not addressed to anyone in particular.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And then this lady here.
Hi there, Susie Martin from Liberty One Communications. We're a planning and policy communications consultancy. My question is, should the Scottish Government rethink its wildland policy? And that's directed particularly at Brian and Matthew, because remote and rural communities will find it extremely difficult to actually engage in community energy if wildland policy sort of continues in the same vein that it has done for the last 6 years. And also, how do we address the perceived tension between renewable energy and environmental protection?
Great, thank you. If I could ask the panelists just to answer one of the questions, that would be great. So, Asheen, I don't know if you wanted to come in on one of them.
One particularly, I think I would come to maybe Dan on your question on Kent and options for community energy organisations. And as you said, it needn't be like a one big roof with large asset. It could be multiple roofs, but you aggregate multiple schools or community buildings together, and that could make a project work. And your idea of heat pumps is fantastic. So the reason why we don't have a very articulate or restrictive definition of community energy is because it's up to the community to decide what's the best solution for them. And if you've got more private owned individual properties on a street, and there's a way of collective purchasing to reduce price and install, and you as a local energy group are coming in as the procurer and installer and making sure that it's all done well, then that's a lovely community energy project, and that would be great if you get the consent. So there's flexibility, and that's the beauty about community energy. You've got really large scale, you've got really small, micro, and so it's a whole range. So I would say go for what you think is right and consult those around you, and if you've got an appetite, you've got a project, then run with it.
Patrick?
On that, talk to Community Energy South. They did, under the renewable heat premium payment, in 2013, 2014, they ran some community heat pump trials around the Sussex Weald and Hastings area. So they've got some experience, and there are some issues around, solar on the roof is a fitting. Heat pumps are seen as fixtures, so there are mortgage implications, and there are other things that you need to be aware of when you have secondary ownership of heat that just make it slightly more complex in the negotiation. It's doable, but it's not as simple. I mean, the offshore wind community benefit is the more interesting proposal. I think you can take that to nuclear and small modular nuclear and all sorts of other energy generation rather than just the offshore. I don't think we have looked at how we can do that. Offshore wind, a lot of it is done by the Crown Estate rather than the developer, because technically they own where it comes ashore. So there are multiple parties involved in those conversations about that community benefit. It's not just as simple as the developer in an onshore wind scenario, because there are other partners who bring that ashore and where that. For the islands, it's a little bit clearer. For sort of the East Coast, we're talking about Grimsby and Teesside, it's a little bit more murky as to which community is benefiting, because they're. But we'd really be interested in talking to you about looking at those sort of community benefits and how they might work.
Thank you. Brian?
I'll to answer one question, I suppose. The one that was directed straight at me, the one I was trying to avoid. Thank you very much. The wildland policy, I think, as I said to that gentleman there, I think if we're really going to be serious about tackling climate change, I think from a governmental perspective, we have to start changing the way in which we develop policy. And for me, it's a part of my portfolio that I'm still getting my head round. But what I can say is that what I have observed is that most policy, climate change policy, tends to focus around an urban bias. It's not. I think it's biased against the rural communities. I think there's a lot of politicians and policy doesn't recognise that rural is a very different environment than urban. So, to that respect, I think we do have to revisit the whole the way in which we frame the wildland policy. There is definitely a tension, as you've quite said, between renewable and the environment, and you would think the two of them go hand in hand, but of course I'm not sure that they do, especially when we're looking at things like onshore wind. And where that getting licences for where we put onshore wind. As I said, in the south of Scotland, I have I think probably the most onshore wind that there is. I have the second biggest onshore wind farm in my constituency, and without question, pouring hundreds of thousands of tonnes of concrete into the ground has an impact on the water table, has an impact on communities, small communities in that arena. They're not benefiting from it as in the way that we should. I think that was raised there that the offshore wind is not benefiting communities in the way it can, in the way it should. And it all comes back to that question right at the way at the start of how do we take communities with us? How do we take individuals with us? So it is going to. I think I don't have the answer, but I do think we have to rethink that policy and take into account how the variation that's going to be required between urban and rural, because the rural economy works in a very different way than the urban economy, and my post bag is filled with all of that all of the time, and as I say, I don't have the answer, but we definitely have to reconsider. Governments, not just the Scottish government, but governments are going to have to reconsider the way in which policy is developed.
Vidya or Matthew, I don't know if you could answer Lizzie's question on the role of digital.
Yeah, so that was the one I was
Excellent,
thinking of
brilliant.
I wanted that one.
I mean, I think you're right. There is a huge opportunity, and what we already see with, say, community share issues is that the core of the people that buy the shares tend to be local, but there's always a periphery of people who are socially motivated by the issue. And I think for me, it comes back to telling a better story about community energy and a clearer story about community energy if we want to tap into some of that broader reach that digital might allow us to have in terms of people beyond the local community. But I also think we want to be careful because of what I described as sort of the comparative advantage of community energy, that we don't get too diffuse, that I think there is a real value in that real local ownership. But I think the penumbra of wider ownership, I mean, most of the schemes that we've supported, not just in energy but beyond, do have a broader range. And often people, say if it's in a city, people from the more affluent side of a city supporting a project on the less affluent side of the city because they see it sort of as benefiting them in the wider sense, not because they will ever, benefit directly. So I do think there are real opportunities there.
Matthew?
Do you mind if I go back to the land point? I figure we've kind of addressed. So that would be the one I'd like to address. The way that you framed the question, I probably contest, is that it's one or the other. And for me, I think the question is what should we be doing with the land, and how does that map on to broader principles? And so when I look, I love the outdoors. I enjoy walking, enjoy being out, and Scotland's full of it. I look at it and I think, well, we should be trying to reduce emissions as much as possible with this land. 2, we want to maximise biodiversity. 3, we should be repopulating these landscapes because they're a lot more. Oftentimes they're desolate and have been depopulated over centuries, which have obviously been well accounted for. And the 4th is access to land, not just access in terms of right to roam, but access in terms of ownership. So this should be distributed, and we're not doing any of that very well in Scotland at the moment. You look at these landscapes, the peatlands are degrading, there's very little forestation, very little biodiversity. These landscapes are typically being maintained for deer or grouse. And actually probably where we are doing best is access to land and the right to roam. So for me, we should be looking at it and saying if we can do something that meets those 4 criteria, we're doing the right thing for the climate, for the wider environment and for the people. And one thing I'd just like to add there, one area which I think isn't discussed enough, is the potential for local carbon offsetting schemes. So there's been a lot of discussion at COP, which we haven't discussed much actually, a lot of discussion at COP about net, as part of the net zero, the offsetting part. And these international schemes are very problematic. If we can potentially see schemes which have a local focus, I'm going to consume this amount of carbon this year, my conscience and wallet will afford me to invest in a local carbon offsetting scheme, and I can see over there the implication of that. I think that's a very powerful statement and could really put these rural communities in good stead going forward.
Great. I'm conscious of time. We have got a little bit longer because we started a bit later, so I'm just going to get in some of the anonymous questions very quickly and then ask panellists to wrap up. But just to kind of reflect on some comments more than questions that have come through. Linda talks about community energy, the definition, talking about enabling community energy to thrive. That should be very important. A few anonymous questions or statements have really criticised the closure of the feed-in tariff. An interesting question, quite philosophical, from Michael McAlpine, who asks, are transient places, if we have that, does it mean it's difficult to establish community energy? That was quite interesting. And also a question from David Walsh, who says, how can we raise the profile of community energy and make the public more aware of it? And then a final question here that I wanted to flag from a chap called Connor, who says, which is connected to the question that David Walsh raised, which is there a lack of experts in communities who can run or lead these energy initiatives? How do we support community projects so that they are viable? Sorry I wasn't able to get everybody's questions in, but I wanted to particularly prioritise the people who'd given their name. So, I don't know if any of the panelists want to pick up on any of those comments and give their sort of concluding remarks. Perhaps we'll start with Patrick.
So very quickly, on the peer mentoring, we made it a condition of the Rural Community Energy Fund that anybody taking a phase 2 project, so actually developing a project rather than just a feasibility, had to, instead of paying that back, as was the original design, had to put mentoring time in, and Community Energy England are developing that mentoring program as a result of that. So we're doing that. As for profile raising, we've just had a bus tour. Planet Mark have just gone around the whole of the UK. They're actually outside the green zone today in an electric bus collecting stories of communities and local government and businesses and what they've done so that we can create a thousand flowers blooming picture rather than every single individual flower being seen, but the narrative of scale. And then I think I just wanted to touch on the digital point because I think that the opportunity to own is missing the bigger picture of smart local energy systems, where the digital capacity allows, especially if you're electrifying heat and transport simultaneously, communities to really integrate those systems through their homes with storage, and allows sharing of generation like Bethesda have done. Half-hourly tariffs will make that, smart meters and things like that will make that really live opportunity to have really localized generation and usage. So I think digital has a massive part to play, and we haven't unlocked half of what it can do. And the ownership part is probably the tip of the iceberg on that digital side.
Matthew?
So I think the point on the experts and capacity building, I kind of touched upon this before, but you tend to have, in the places where the projects are happening, you've already got the experts and the capacity. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're completely blasted. They don't have much spare bandwidth to give. It's the question marks of where it isn't happening. And it's what I would like to see is government to stand up and to support the community energy trade associations, Community Energy Scotland and the like, to provide these community groups with funding to transfer their expertise, pay them as consultants to go and consult on a project. And that would actually give a whole network of opportunity for leading experts on leading projects to go and tell them, because at the moment they're just doing it out of goodwill. And there's only so much goodwill and time to go around.
I'm just conscious of time. So
yeah, that's fine. I'm done. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, video.
So I think I've sort of left it's been a great session, so thank you. But I suppose I'm left with a question in my own head as probably the main sort of philanthropic funder of community energy. We seem collectively to be not doing a good enough job at selling this concept, both to the policy community and government, but also to other communities where this isn't yet being taken up, and people don't necessarily see that this is for them, or they don't see that they are able to do it. So I suppose I'm sort of leaving thinking, what more could we do? Who else should we be doing it with to really put community energy at the centre? I think people in this room feel that it should be much more at the centre than it currently is, and there's clearly a communications job to do, both upwards to government but also outwards to community. So I'll take that away, I think.
Great. Asheen.
I have a couple of points. I wanted to come back to Finn's point around Ofgem's role, and I think Ofgem's role is linked to policy, so it covers both policy and regulation. There is a lack of opportunity in the sense that renewable energy generation isn't recognised, and the social value isn't recognised in decision making. So I just wanted to note and validate that, recognise that point, put it out there, because it is a missed opportunity. I want to draw on the experience of London, where we have a London Community Energy Fund, and over the last 4 years, I think the Mayor of London has launched 5 phases of a London Community Energy Fund, offers feasibility funding, capital funding and flexible funding. So that has really helped community energy grow within London. Our ask to government is about establishing a community national fund that has those similar parts, which will enable new projects to thrive. And my third point is around collaboration. I think, Patrick, you mentioned it, and there's a lot of work to be done with local authorities and requiring them to work with their community energy organisations, and I think that is really key, and there will be funding coming through. Local authorities are doing a lot of work on not just renewable energy, but whole system approach. Heating and building is a huge opportunity for that collaboration to take place. And in terms of skills and expertise, Matthew, you're just absolutely right in the sense that we are maxed out in terms of the capacity that we have, and I think there's collaboration with private sector to bring in skills and expertise to really help that scale and funding. So what we need is that infusion and that collaboration, I think, will really help community energy grow. And on digital, I think
sorry, I'm just conscious of time. Sorry.
I'll make my
Brian,
points then.
final thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting. Listen to Matthew's response to the same question. Kind of, to me, highlights what the issues is here, because we have a disagreement here, and if we were a government, we would be having this discussion. I mean, I visited, I think that catch-all way in which that was described kind of worries me, because I visited Craig and Gillen in my constituency, which are doing peat restoration, reforestation, they're doing green hedging, they're linked in with Ayrshire College doing rural skills. So there are landowners who are doing a really good job, and there are those who are not. So I think we've got to be careful of that. But the outcome here, for me, what's important here is that from a government's perspective, we start with the outcome. And we need to work our way back there. Governments have got to make the green economy easy for everybody to buy into. We have a responsibility as governments to do the PR marketing role, if you like, to take communities with us, to take people with us, and sell the whole concept that what I do in terms of how I recycle or whatever I do, what you do, has an impact across the globe, and it has that much of an impact. But if we all actually did that much there, we make a huge amount of difference. So I am very much about personal responsibility. How do we create that personal responsibility? How do we promote community energy generation and use, and how that feeds into the wider network? And for me, what I take away from here is how do we get from where we are to the outcome we want, and developing that route map.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Really very detailed discussion, and I'm glad that community energy, we've been able to talk about it here at COP. Do go to the bus outside the green zone as well, and contribute there as well. Just to say, you can join us for other events that we've got. We're in this room. We've got another one at 2. So I will actually say for you to politely, if you could leave the room immediately afterwards. There is a reception area with drinks and food, so you can network out there. So please, if you could just vacate the room, that would be great, but continue your conversations outside the room. A big thank you again to Power to Change for all the work that you're doing in this area, but also for partnering with us on this event. And a big thank you to our panel, an honorary panel, Will. It was a really rich discussion, so a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.